everyone, and welcome to one of our knowledge transfer sessions. Today we're continuing the topic of annuities, specifically income riders, which is kind of, I would argue, a subset of annuities and what we're trying to accomplish. So I figured we'd go over this, and hopefully, once again, this is more informational in nature, not designed to be a sales pitch. We're trying to give the good, the bad, the ugly, and precisely explain what these are, basically. So as in general, today's information has to be treated as general in nature. When we talk about insurance products, or really anything in the financial services industry, we're talking this at a high level, and certain details could be omitted that could be relevant. So just recognize that today's information has to be treated as general in nature. A little bit about myself. I have more than 18 years experience in the financial services industry, and I worked inside an insurance company before I became an independent financial advisor. I'm held to fiduciary standards, so usually what I do is I try and give a overview of annuities as tools as part of financial planning, but not necessarily the greatest thing or the worst thing. I think they're just a tool like any other. So today what we're going to be talking about is we're going to talk about the concept of an income rider. What is an income rider? Then we're going to go to the basics. We're going to really dive into it, the basics of the income rider. Then we're talking about the rest of the contract. How does an income rider affect an annuity contract? And then we're going to talk about, is this a good idea or not? Is this a scam, or is this a legitimate tool? So let's talk about just the basic concept of an income rider as part of an annuity. And as a reminder, when I say the word annuity, I would argue the average person, or even the average financial professional, has no idea what you mean when you say just the basic word annuity. An annuity is a contract. There are lots of different styles. And if you watched our video on you don't know what the word annuity means, you'll actually get a sense that we need to be more specific. So today we're talking about an income rider, which is attached to usually variable, indexed, or fixed annuities. And they're pretty popular. And remember, when we talk about rider, riders are the wild card of the annuity industry. Usually when there's a major rider attached to an insurance contract, it's actually better to talk about the rider than the underlying contract. It's more important because, what a rider fundamentally does is it modifies the entire contract, and anything that conflicts with the rider wins. And so if I have a 108-page annuity contract and a 7-page rider, you're really buying that 7-page rider, and then the rest of the annuity contract is covering other situations. And this is where the complexity of annuities really come into play. And there are lots of different types of riders that fundamentally modify annuity contracts. We're talking about today about income riders, but just to give a overview of some of the other ones you're going to run into: guaranteed minimum accumulation benefits, death benefit riders, enhanced death benefit riders, long-term care riders, commuted payout riders, disability income riders, and return of premium riders. These are all riders that can be attached to an annuity contract, and you should assume that if these are attached, it's really modifying a lot of the underlying contract. Now, because annuities are complex, because they're really just contracts, what I suggest is you get something called an illustration. An illustration is actually very, very strong in the insurance industry. Unlike a lot of other financial products, illustrations tend to be highly regulated state by state, which means an insurance company has to create an illustration as a good faith attempt of how the product works. And it usually quite simplistically explains what you're buying, if you know where to look. Even they can be complicated. But the point here is that insurance company illustrations are actually different in the terms of the financial services industry, and they are actually highly regulated. And so because these are unique, I would argue this simplifies the conversation, and I would always get an illustration and look for the guaranteed elements. So we talk about income riders. There can be guaranteed and non-guaranteed elements. And they're both actually really important conversation points. But as a consumer, I would suggest you go to the guaranteed column and understand what that's doing for you first. Because I would argue that most of the time when you're buying insurance products, it's for the guarantee. And if you're seeing non-guaranteed elements, that can still be good, but you might be having certain things omitted. So go find the guaranteed component of the illustration, and you have a good faith attempt on understanding how the product works. So talk just a quick overview of income riders in general. Let's actually really dive into an income rider and how it works. So let's say that I'm looking at buying an annuity, and I want to buy an annuity with an income rider where I'm going to put $500,000 into a contract. And then you might get a contractual guarantee saying you will get this amount of lifetime income for the rest of your life on the year you exercise it. So if you do it year 1, you get $35,000. You do it year 3, you get $42,000. You do it year 9, you get $72,000. You have to wait till this year to start it. So like if you start at year 1 and you get to year 4, you still get the same $35,000 you got at year 1, right? So every year you wait, you get inherently a higher amount as part of your income rider amount. And so this is the basics of how an income rider is supposed to work. This might be guaranteed or non-guaranteed depending upon the type of contract. But basically, you're taking a chunk of money, you're moving it outside of market risk in exchange for this payment stream at some point in the future that's supposed to last for the rest of your life. And there's really two main components here. When you're trying to compare income riders, and if you don't have sophisticated tools, and I'll talk about that in a second, there's really two main components on the income rider side. How does your $500,000 or $500,000 grow? What's the calculation for that? And what is the percentage you get coming out of that usually for the rest of your life? So how does it grow? And what percent do you get? And so using this example here, we have something called a roll-up rate. A roll-up rate is a pretty common industry term. So you start with $500,000, and then every year in this example, by contract, you will get guaranteed 8% growth on that money. You don't get to touch that money, and we'll talk about that later. That is a calculation that you're doing. Then at the end of year, say 1, 5, or 10, you take that roll-up value and you multiply it by the percentage usually guaranteed in the contract, and that's how this entire thing's calculated. And if you're looking at this and going, oh, this seems complicated, it can be, which is why you really want that illustration. And a lot of factors can affect this. Once again, you're going to keep me harping on get that illustration, but are we talking variable versus fixed contracts? Are there going to be bonuses involved? What a bonus is that $500,000, the insurance company may start the calculation by adding 10% to the value or $50,000, then doing the calculation. That's called a bonus. What elements are guaranteed? The previous example could have been fully guaranteed by an insurance company or not, depending upon the contract you're doing. Your age, gender, whether you want single or joint income, and some other factors can affect this as well. But these are your main factors that are going to affect the income rider situation. So how do you use something like an income rider? Well, this is a tool where you're trying to take money away from market risk and get guaranteed income at some point later in life. So let's assume you have $1.5 million at age 61. You can invest this in asset allocation models, target date funds. I mean, the world is numerous of the types of investments you can put $1.5 million in. But one of the things you could do is you could take $500,000 out of this and buy one of these income riders. And so you do this at age 61. And then you retire at age 67. And you've had $1 million that's been growing that you need to bridge the gap between 67 to 70, right? And then when you turn 70, you turn on Social Security plus the income rider. And essentially every morning for the rest of your life when you wake up, you have significant income, around $112,000 in this case. And if you were a couple, you could, in theory, double this depending upon your economic situation. Okay. And then the rest of your money, you can have set up in index funds. You can use, any sort of growth-oriented vehicle, a core holding usually for retirees, but you can just buy index funds and let it ride because you've replicated your working years. By age 70 on, you have basically a paycheck for the rest of your life. Okay. And so this is how you would typically use an income rider. You're using it typically as a bond replacement. Way back at age 61, because you knew you had this guarantee, you would know that you didn't need necessarily as much in bonds. You want a more equity-heavy portfolio typically because you have this income guarantee later. And let's say the market crashes right at age 67. You could have activated this income rider at age 67 as an alternative strategy, as a backup plan as well. So it was pretty flexible, even though you did give away essentially $500,000 to the insurance company. Now, when we talk about income riders, and I mentioned sophisticated tools, getting the illustration is really a really good starting point. But I should argue what you're really buying is specifically an amount of income later in life. So you choose an age and an amount of income for a certain dollar amount, right? So in this example, let's say I'm 61 and I want $120,000 a year for the rest of my life at age 70. Well, there's a cost associated with that. And you can actually go to a tool. There's actually tools out there that'll let you compare over 100 different products at once and figure out what is the cheapest cost to do this. And this is a true calculation for almost any scenario you want to look at. If you're wanting to look at income you want at 65, 67, and you can either define the income amount or the deposit amount, you can generally find, within reason, some of the better products out there. This is problematic, actually, for the public. I'll mention why this could be a problem for you. So I know in the brokerage world, in this example right here, that can be an $80,000 delta, and this was kind of the top of the range. There were actually lots of contracts I could have shown you where, the same amount of income cost $1 million, $1 million too. So there's a wide difference in the amount of premium required to do this $120,000. So it's not crazy to say that by comparison shopping, if you can do this, you can save tens of thousands of dollars, because that's probably correct. But normally when you're getting down the stream of doing an income rider, it's really hard for you to research this on your own. And if you're researching this, you're typically researching sources that are telling you not to do it. And so if you're going down this path, you've been proposed this by a financial professional like myself. And financial professionals, unless you have really robust brokerage contracts, they typically only have 1 or 2 contracts they can sell, which means that even though this comparison shopping is what I would argue the best way to go for this, in your case, you may not be able to comparison shop because the financial professional you trust, only has a certain subset of these products. But the best way you can is if you could educate yourself. I would try and get a brokerage firm to run a chart just like I'm showing right here for any scenario you want to look at. Now, we've talked about an income rider, and an income rider modifies a base annuity contract. So we need to talk about, how does the rest of the contract work? And remember, riders can be attached to almost any type of insurance and annuity contract, okay? Fixed index, or variable. So there's going to be an underlying contract style for these contracts. And one of the things I'll mention is one of the typical things that happens is when you add a rider to something, all those articles saying that there's high fees on annuities, it starts to become true. Because riders cost money. They're an extra fee out of the contract. And it can be an actual extra percent. And then not only that, insurance companies, what they like to do is they like to make the underlying contract as well a little worse. So like a variable contract might have higher expense ratios inside their sub-accounts. The fixed index might have lower cap rates. The fixed account might just have naturally lower interest. So in general, I would suggest that if you ever see a rider on a contract, the underlying contract has now been weakened slightly, the generic contract, in exchange for that specific benefit. Okay? So the first thing you got to recognize is the underlying contract is usually a little worse in exchange for the income rider, which might be better. Now, what happens if you die early? If you die early, what happens is you get something called the accumulation value. So the accumulation value is different than how the income rider calculation works. Remember how I said the income rider has this 8% roll-up? Well, what people can get confused on, or unethical agents can not explain very well to them, is that 8% roll-up only works as part of the income rider calculation. If you die, you get the underlying returns of the investment. So if it's a variable contract, it'd be based upon market rates of return minus expenses, which are kind of high, minus withdrawals. If it's a fixed or fixed index contract, same exact concept where it's whatever it grew minus withdrawals. And so you do actually have a death benefit, which is good, but it is different from your income value. So on the screen here, I have income value at 1 million versus different accumulation values, just to show that you might get slightly different amounts depending upon how the contract is done. But there also is a death benefit, so there is something there if you die early, typically. Now, if you can cancel the contract, once again, that's where the accumulation value comes into play. And this is why there's a 128-page insurance contract is what happens if you do any of these other things, okay? And so if you cancel the contract, once again, it's that accumulation value minus withdrawals. But you also get something called surrender charges that can come into play, or even market value adjustment. And so, canceling the contract, you should recognize if you cancel the contract, it can be very expensive here. So you shouldn't enter it into an income rider contract unless you think it's a really good option for you, because the getting out of it can be very expensive. Now, I always suggest make sure you get your illustration, because when we're talking about income riders, you're really trying to buy this income stream later in life. You should have an illustration, and ideally a guaranteed illustration, showing exactly what the amount's going to be later in life, so that you can make it as part of your overall financial plan. And then the rest of the illustration kind of shows you some other things that might occur, right? You're not buying this because you're intending to cancel it. You're not buying this because you intend to die early. Those are things that might occur, so you just need to understand how those can work. Now, is this a good idea or not, right? There's always this big question, is this a good idea? Well, it comes as one problem we always run into the financial services industry, to guarantee or not to guarantee. That is the question. And here's a basic problem. Let's say you buy a balanced fund. It's usually a very suitable investment for retiree. That has inherent market risk. It usually has around a 12% standard deviation, which means in any year it can go down 12%. And some people just can't handle that. Statistically, some people really don't like statistics. They really want a guarantee. And what an income rider is going to do is it will guarantee you essentially a paycheck later in life. And it's going to let you take greater market risk with the rest of your funds, because in theory you've bought this guarantee. Okay, but it is this idea of locking up your money in exchange for a guarantee, and you either want a guarantee or you don't. And it's not perfect. When we look at these and we model these, essentially what you're doing with an income rider is you're spending your own money until you hit mortality. And then once you hit mortality, like around 78, 79, that's when you start getting the insurance company's money. So it really is, you're buying insurance in case you live a really long time. Depending upon your risk tolerance or investing capabilities, you might be able to beat an income rider from an investing philosophy. Income riders are essentially fixed contracts. And so investing can potentially beat it depending upon your skill set in investing. I can build portfolios to beat an income rider, as an example. I can't guarantee it, whereas the income rider might be guaranteed. So there's a difference, a concept there. Remember, you're buying this for income. So if you don't use an income rider, it's usually a poor investment. And I remember when I worked for an insurance company, there was an internal statistics given around that over 90% of income rider contracts never exercise their income rider. And this is over 20 years ago. So I don't know if it's still true today. Actually, even at the time, I didn't have an industry publication. But I always remember that the majority of people buying these never exercise the income rider. So that always bothered me, actually. And then finally, remember, you have to interact with an insurance agent typically to buy an income rider. And that can be, depending upon your process in getting there, daunting. A lot of people don't like to talk to insurance agents for good reason, honestly, because they might try and sell you something. They might, philosophical difference, just the stress of talking to someone. But now here's an interesting thing. It might mathematically win. So I do a lot of modeling, and I model different types of portfolios, and I was modeling some income riders the other day. And I was shocked because it was winning on the back end. What I mean is that when someone died, they statistically should have more money by buying the income rider than not. And I was kind of backtracking. I was like, why is this doing so well versus other options? And it was a pretty optimized contract in that situation. And I was like, well, I'm getting guarantees and I'm getting more at death. What am I missing here? I was a little shocked. And as I was kind of breaking it down, it started to make sense to me. A lot of times you use balance funds or target date funds. They're investing in bond funds right now. And when you look at the last 10 years of history, when you start modeling based upon the last 10 years, fixed income is doing terrible. A lot of the financial services industry is how proficient you are on fixing this math right here, basically. Because, using the Fidelity Freedom Fund, about 25% of its investment here is in an investment-grade bond fund earning less than 2.5% over the last 10 years. reasonably, even you can go buy a CD and beat that number, right? So actually, there's a good chance income riders, even though you're paying commission to someone behind the scenes, probably are beating that number. So kind of close this out. Once again, we prefer process and not product. We think this is a tool, and this is actually, I would argue, an appropriate tool for someone looking for income and retirement. A well-rounded plan explores this and other options. I throw ideas like a balanced fund to your asset allocation. If you looked at my channel, you'll see I talk about income buckets and protection buckets. Depending upon your concept or the type of retirement you like, I think this is just one of the options of many that can work. Notice I'm not a fee-only financial planner. I do fee-only financial planning, but I also own a brokerage agency that my business partners primarily run, that we have access to a huge number of different insurance company products, basically. And so I will mention that if you can actually comparison shop this, it can be tens of thousands of dollars in your favor, i.e., you want $100,000 a year of income. Do you want $100,000 a year of income, or do you want $100,000 a year and to go spend $20,000 on something you just really want to do, like a big vacation? All right, those are the types of things that comparison shopping get you. Now, a sneaky thing, and a lot of agents will hate this if you watch this video, ask the agent to do a trail commission. Most of these contracts pay their commission up front in one big lump sum. And a trail commission means that there's some calculation behind the scene, but basically as long as the contract's there, someone's making a little bit of money, but they don't get it all up front. And the nice thing is that means that there's always an incentive to service you 10, 20 years down the road. There's incentive for the next generation to service you. A lot of people buy from agents who are close to their own age, as an example. And so, I would really suggest you consider doing a trail commission if you can. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this is helpful kind of illuminating a more difficult topic, which is the topic of annuities. And now we're specifically talking about income riders. A lot of stuff I had to gloss over and try and summarize because there are a lot of different types of products out there. I typically am more in the guaranteed column. I really like guaranteed income riders, generally, as opposed to things that have more variable components around the income. But everyone has their different opinions on that. So we will continue these videos here in the future. So we'll have a couple more videos on annuities, and then we'll go off from there to the next topic. Thank you, and I hope you have a good day.